Okay, everyone, welcome to 345 Tech Talks. I'm Andrew from 345, and I'm with Steve Pereira, who's an expert in software engineering, DevOps, getting value from your software projects, all those sort of things. So welcome, Steve, to the podcast. And well, it's fantastic having you on here. I mean, we've had a chat before. So do you want to just say a little bit about yourself and what led you to this point and what you focus on now? Maybe we'll start with that.
Sure. Yeah, I always love the question of what led you to this point, because I'm a big systems thinker. So it gets me thinking of like the origins of the universe. But I won't geek out and focus
Yeah.
too
So
much on
in the beginning was the word, and then
right.
we'll go from there.
Exactly. How much time do we have? No, wait. Um, Really, the origins of what I'm doing now really do come from my childhood. I've always really kind of been obsessed with trying to get the most out of the least amount of effort, and with laziness being the major attribute at play. But I always really fascinated about process and how things come together. I spent my childhood actually taking things apart and putting them back together to figure out how they work, and that went from the physical to the virtual when I found out about software and learned more about software engineering. So I've been through a bunch of roles there, build and release, infrastructure, automation, CTO for a few years, and now consulting under my own company. And my company is really focused on how do you look at what you're doing to produce value and optimize what you can using the least amount of effort. Back to that laziness. What is the 20% effort that's going to get you 80% of the benefit? Because I find that a lot of teams don't look at their process often enough, and they don't look at what they're doing. They're focused on what to do. And oftentimes when we look at what we're doing and how we're doing it, we get a huge performance improvement, and we can focus on whatever we like because we will have unlocked a higher level of performance. So that's what I'm really fascinated about now.
Well, that's it. I mean, Pareto principle always applies, isn't it? The yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that then. That because funnily enough, before I worked in software, I was actually I mean I trained as an aeronautical engineer, and I worked in aerospace, and at the time, way back then, and this is like the late 90s, the company I worked for was going through a big lean manufacturing initiative, and so we went through this whole thing over a couple of years of really looking at every process. Where was the value created? Where was the waste? And it was a it was a very formative thing, and then sort of lean kind of took probably another 10 years to get into the software world. But lean, it's all about finding value, isn't it? And understanding where your value is. So what are the main well, I suppose let's just wind it back again. I mean, where do people go wrong? Everyone wants value. Where'd they
That's a
go
great
wrong?
question. I like that question a lot. I think that software really suffered from a lack of distributed knowledge and information, right? There was a lot of people, because it was so accessible and you didn't have to go through any formal training, and the training that was available was sort of the mind that software is a completely new paradigm, right? It breaks all the rules, and there's very little that it has in common with the physical world. And I think what we've come to realize is that that's less true, probably all the time. As we understand the models and the activities of software better, and as people in the software world sort of reverse engineer and go back to the origins of things like physical manufacturing and find out, okay, well, we can borrow this. This doesn't quite work. This is at a different ratio. I think the ratio thing for me is interesting. It's interesting that you brought up the Pareto principle, because I think that I spent some time earlier this week kind of illustrating the difference between software and manufacturing. And if you look at the different types of activities, there is a different ratio in that in manufacturing, you will spend 20% of your time, for instance, on design and development, and then you will spend 80% of your time on production and delivery.
Yeah.
And that gets reversed in software, right? You spend 80% of your time in design and development, and then your production and delivery is a small portion of the entire process. And other than that, I think there's one major difference that that Brian Finster's reminded me of on several occasions, and I've seen through Gary Gruber's book, Engineering the DevOps Transformation. He talks a lot about the parallels with manufacturing, and that is quality control, right? Because
Yeah.
you can't control for quality when you're trying to change the product every single iteration. You have to come up with new ways of judging quality and assessing quality, and it's a much softer process. You have to basically use guidelines and rules and test what you can, but accept that there's going to be uncertainty. There's going to be this area that you can't test, that you've got to basically guide, but you can't ensure.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's almost like because there's one of the other concepts in manufacturing was that I remember being taught about was the difference between traditional quality and and total quality management. Because traditional quality was, that was how Rolls-Royce built motor cars, and they'd have people, and they'd almost, you'd know that things don't always line up, but you'd have expert fitters that are just tweaking everything and just shaving a little bit off with the file, and so that it was just perfect. But everything was bespoke, and then total quality is, more modern. The sort of the modern quality that you kind of think is where everything is consistent. So and you have tolerances, so that you know that if you're within tolerance, and everything else will fit together, and so that's kind of, and software kind of comes from, like, say, a generation or two ago. It was a cottage industry with traditional quality, where the developers there and they were just tweaking everything. And, I'll just
Right.
go in and just, and
it was like it was a craftsman. Everyone was obsessed with craftsmanship, right?
Yeah, and there are still, some manufacturers that do that craftsman thing, but they're hugely expensive. They can't scale, and generally they tend to lag behind. But there's some kind of, aura about it that people like.
Yeah, they also have the brand to carry them through, right?
Yeah.
Which is like, people put up with the inefficiency of that process because that's what they're paying for. They know that they're paying for that inefficiency because they know that it results in this kind of touching perfection or reaching out towards perfection. But I think, if you ask any customer of a software product, they don't want that. They just want it to work, and they just want to be able to do what they want with it. But I think your concept of the tolerance, like what you mentioned with tolerance, I think is very powerful in software. And that is where we need a lot of attention, is like focusing on what's acceptable tolerance. And so few people do this. So few people with their team say, it's, here are the trade-offs, right? If we look at a decision filter, we value X over Y. That gets so seldom used.
And where is the line of good enough?
Right.
Because one of the other things, I know we're kind of going really fast here, but one of the things that almost all the developers that I've worked with, they want to do really well. They want to produce the best they can. And the problem is that almost every time you write software, you write it for the first time, you learn. So by the time you get to the end of it, you already know how you can do it better.
Right.
And so that point at which you're trying to tell developers, look, stop now. It's good enough. But they, no, I know how much better it can be, and then they keep going. And so it's that is a real problem. When is it good enough?
And I think, and we've been so obsessed in Agile. There's this obsession with the definition of done, but not, not with good enough, right? Not with formal tolerance, and this idea that, and I think that's been a big hindrance in the industry, because it's sort of stretched out these lead times, while people focus on getting things right, instead of finding out that, you know, like we've heard so many times before, most features aren't ever used.
Yeah.
And if they are used, they're probably misused because we're not getting feedback enough, fast enough, and we're not getting high quality feedback from our customers. And that should be the ultimate focus, right? And getting that feedback means go as fast as possible, right? Get to good enough, put it out, even if you're putting it out to only beta users or internally, right? I mean, these are all possible things, and there's different tolerances for each one. But that rapid feedback is the most valuable. It's not, getting to perfect or getting to something that we're comfortable with, because and that's where process to me trumps so many things, because it's that super highway that's going to allow you to throw any work into the pipeline and get some feedback. And the more robust and powerful that pipeline is, the more you can give it work at any level. You can give it, you can give it an idea and it will test your idea like that. That's where I see the future of software development process, and the value stream is really like, throw it whatever you have, and it will have a a system that can test, give you feedback, and move you to the next phase. Starting from, I have an idea. So the pipeline starts where you have an idea, and it says, well, okay, does your idea incorporate these things? Is it thinking about the customer? Which customer persona is this serving, and how is it serving those goals? And I think we're very early in that process, because a lot of the software engineering process that we have right now is, um, you know, make a guess. It's usually not even a hypothesis. It's not even formalized.
Hmm.
Make a guess, build something, put it out into the world, and start working on the next thing. And there's really no synthesis of feedback. There's really no processing of acceptance data, or how that is actually working in the real world. So then you're just flying blind, and you sort of get used to this idea that we just have to burn down this backlog and we'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting couple of things there, because two of the big kind of streams of building software. One of them is, I'm building the software product, where the product manager sort of looks at, opens their window and looks out, and then says to everyone, build it like this.
Right.
And then the other one is when you're inside a corporate and you're building bespoke software inside a corporate, and then you have some analysts that wander around, and then they come back and say, build it like this. But the problem is always the same, that you have that, there's that kind of it's always someone is making, having an opinion on that. And with the best will in the world, one person's opinion can't encapsulate all those needs. So how do you get beyond that? How and where do you start on making sure that is achievable, but it's not, but doesn't overwhelm you, because you've got to filter it as well.
Yeah, and I think, for me, the key is in those guardrails provided by your value stream, the pipeline that you create for taking an idea, whether it's from an analyst, from a customer, from an industry report, from a inspiration in the middle of the night, and test it all the way through at whatever level you can test it, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, and develop it into something of value, and then deliver it for the purpose of getting validation that it was actually the thing you thought it was, as valuable as you thought it was, or it could be more valuable than you ever expected. That's the other end, is that these things don't have to be always worse. We're not always saying, like, I hope this is great, and then the customers say, oh well, maybe the next thing you build will be better. Sometimes we build things and they're fantastically valuable. And sometimes we build things and they're not valuable day one, but 3 months later, people start to use it for some reason because some magical confluence of events drives that into reality. And then now we're getting all this feedback, and you need the ability to process that feedback and incorporate it into your process now. So I think that this is a bigger picture than we're currently looking at, and we need models and guidelines and tools in order to support that, because you cannot do it in your head, you cannot do it alone. You have to do this by collaborating with many different stakeholders with different perspectives and different roles. And that's another area where I see the value stream as this foundation that ties everyone together and gets everybody thinking of, okay, well, this is my part. I have people upstream that are sending me value. And I'm supposed to amplify that and pass it to somebody else downstream. And so without a model that ties all of us together in the same direction with the customer as the North Star, then we're really going to struggle with that until that becomes the normal.
Yeah. So let me paint a scenario then. That you got here's a typical software startup. You've got a couple of guys have an idea. They bang out some code, usually with very little process. It's usually, in the early days especially, it's just bang out some code, get this thing out there into an app store or something like that, or it's maybe a web-based SaaS product, and they get that out there. People start using it. Oh, this is good. We'll get a couple more guys on, so you get like 4 guys now coding away, and then you got more, and then you get more features out, and then you get 6 guys, 8 guys coding away, and then at some point you hit the wall where first of all, you've got so much code now that you're scared to change anything, because you're as scared of breaking anything as you are of putting a new feature in. You've got a whole load of people that don't understand the whole thing because it's just grown, and you've got and then and things very often grind to a halt, and then this is where people say, we need to re-architect everything, and
right.
So and that's what often happens. So in the kind of the way that you look at value, the sort of thing that you do, at what point would you be intervening and saying, actually, you've got to be doing this before that goes wrong? I mean, whereabouts does that fit into the whole picture?
Well, I mean, the funny thing about being a consultant is that you can't really convince anybody to take your advice until something is on fire, right? And so I don't get called until something is an absolute disaster, and they can't do anything that they want to do, and they realize that they're for them to make any kind of action is so painful that they need someone to come in and unblock the process. And sometimes it's not that it's blocked. It could be just so complex that nobody can keep it in their head anymore, and they're not sure what's happening, right? And so they could be a very successful organization. They might have millions of dollars that they want to invest, and they're not sure where to put it. That's another very common case where they have something that works, but if you're going to make a bet, what lever do you pull? What knob do you tweak so that things don't get worse if they're good? And if you want to, boost performance, you have to know where to put your investment, because you're afraid of disrupting things, right? Of course, you don't want to change something for the worse. But what I advise people, and what I'd love to see become regular practice, is this idea of stepping away from the work every 3 to 6 months to look at how the work works, right? Look at how we deliver value to customers, because as I mentioned, that machine, the assembly line of value, is what allows you to constantly pivot, to constantly shave off technical debt, to stay away from these large changes that introduce so much disruption or calcification into the code that break things, that cause new functionality to sort of be hidden away and obfuscated, that can't be reviewed because there's just too much to go through. All of this is kind of addressed by small batches, right? Flowing through a highly instrumented pipeline. And you know, it has been very difficult to build that pipeline over the years, but I think that there's no excuse now. You know, the level that we're at with tooling and how
The
simple it
problem's
is.
been solved, hasn't it? The problem has been
Right.
solved. It's the as with always, it's the mindset. And again, going back to when I worked in manufacturing, that you know, it's the whole thing that the people would make, you know, batches of X. Let's say, because where I work, they made one of the things they made was fuel pumps for aircraft, and so they might make 100, and so they'd make like 100 of these, and then they make 100 of, you know, 100 housings, then 100 motors, and then 100 kind of shafts to go between them, and then 200 bearings because you've got one each end, and you'd be making all the hundreds and hundreds of things, and all the money that's gone into that, and then you know, and 100 of these things at the end of it, after 3 months, would plop out at the end of the production line, and you can sell them. And lean was just the whole thing of, well, instead of taking 100 days to make 100 units, why don't you make one every day?
Right.
And then, so after day one, you've sold one, you get the money for it, and then, and trying to get as close to that as possible was the thing. And it's a bit like that with, you know, most IT projects, particularly big IT projects. They maybe did have 2 code drops a year, so you got like, you know, 150 days, and you know, they cost, you know, some of these cost a lot of money. Yeah, I mean, we've worked on plenty of projects that overall come in at, you know, have a burn rate of hundreds of thousands of pounds, dollars a month, and you know, you can burn that for 6 months before you see any value, and it's like, that's a lot to spend before you
It's
see anything
scary.
back. Whereas the whole thing is like, well, if I do this today, can you be using that tomorrow? And that's, it's easy to say, and like you say, that it's not a technical problem,
Right.
but there is a very kind of, so what are the mindset things that get in the way of people doing that? Because you know, there is a safety, and, you know, why do people retreat to the, I'll release twice a year? Why do people retreat into that? You know, what's blocking them from saying, hey, let's just get this stuff out?
I think that there's a few common things that come up, and a lot of people, and it's mostly, from my perspective, it's due to misunderstanding customer needs, right? They misinterpret the signals that they get from customers. They misinterpret the signals that they get from the industry as well. And one of the most common is, our customers don't want us to release that often, right? They want twice a year. They're used to twice a year. It takes them so long to set up the product and transition that they can only accept, you know, 2 releases a year. So us going any faster than that is waste. And it takes a while for people. They need to basically look at what is possible in small batches and feature toggles and dark launches and internal releases versus external releases, versioning practices, dependency management. There's a lot that people need to learn in order to defeat these notions that they need to operate under a different model, under a project model. And it's no wonder, because Agile evolved as a response to projects, right? It didn't come from Lean. And that I think is one of the biggest problems that we've had in software, is from the very start, Agile, extreme programming, Scrum, even DevOps came out of project-based thinking, So no wonder it has seeped into every aspect of how we develop software. And it's only now that we're going back to lean. It's only now that we're sort of like backing the car down the road to get to the fork where we split off into project world and stay on the road of continuous delivery, true continuous delivery, true continuous flow of value. And that's, you see people sort of discovering value streams, but they've always been there. They've always been the best way to do this work.
Well, I mean, the other funny thing, and let me just remind myself of the word, but Agile Manifesto. There is the funny thing is there is nothing in the Agile Manifesto that I disagree with, really. Because there are things in it like that deliver working software frequency from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference to a shorter timescale. It's our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. The principles are all they're all sound, right. But then somehow, because I love the Agile Manifesto, and then there's a lot of companies we work with that just think Agile's a thing, I want to buy it, and that's where it goes wrong. And so have you got any thoughts on where does it go? Like you say, in terms of backing the car down to the fork in the road, I mean, why is it people who want to be agile, who want to release more often, why do they get in such a mess?
Yeah, I think because even before, I mean, the Agile Manifesto is not that old relative to how long we've been building software and implementing software projects and technical projects. And because of
it's about 20 years old, isn't it?
Yeah, so the structure, I think it's 20 years old very recently, actually, last couple of weeks. But because of how we structure organizations, right, back to the org chart and how IT was sort of spun up as its own entity, as a, almost like HR, right? I mean, HR doesn't exist in the flow of any work in an organization.
It's
right?
Not. It has processes.
It's a static department, right?
They're not not embedded within the value creating part of the business.
Right. So, and I think that when IT arose as a cost center, something that was necessary to do other work, it was sort of like, let's reach out to IT, get the thing that we need from IT, and carry on. And what was never really considered was the idea that technology is an enabler for everything that we do across the organization, not its own entity. It's a support. It's like electricity. And when I think back to the early days of manufacturing, you had steam powered factories. And when they switched over to electricity, they didn't recognize any productivity or performance gain because everything was still arranged as if it had to be hooked up to pulleys in the old steam engine. And only when we started to reimagine what is possible now that electricity is untethering you from the central stack, the central column of your pulley system, and you don't need to have everything sort of localized according to that. You've eliminated that constraint, which means that now you can reorganize according to flow. And I see the same thing in software. You can now organize as a value stream. You can now create a company structure that is facilitating flow and group all of your teams along value streams. And we're starting to see actionable ways of doing this, which is really exciting. Like team topologies is all about this. It's all about this migration towards stream-aligned teams and platforms, things that facilitate flow by, instead of having your org chart where everything is sort of like this reverse tree, in a software world, the electricity is enabling you to organize in streams, and streams that flow together and flow apart, but always oriented towards the customer, not the top of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a big mindset shift. We've been talking about it for quite some time, but there's very little that is actionable that people can take away. And also I think that another big thing that we're missing is ways to learn it with our hands, right? Ways to learn this by doing. That's been missing, and that's been very challenging. You know, we don't have very valuable tools, and that's kind of what I love about mapping, is that you learn all of these concepts. You learn about flow. You learn about what happens when we align ourselves to value streams by doing it in a virtual way. So you don't have to reorganize your company to see it. You can see it by mapping and seeing, okay, how this changes the flow, how this changes the way that we think about things.
So in terms of this sort of value mapping, then what have you got some kind of good examples of how that actually looks when you come into an organization? How does that look? I mean, what sort of things are you trying to pick out from that to say, here's the bits of value and here's how they link together? And how do you what's some good examples of that?
The most common process that I tackle when I go and work with organizations is their release process, because it's usually the biggest, most cumbersome thing. A lot of teams are organized in sprints, and they do a reasonable job of performing well in sprints because it's, you know, fairly tight iterations. But when it comes time to releases, you're usually batching, right? You're usually combining multiple sprints from multiple teams, and that's where things kind of start to get challenging. So by looking at a release process, oftentimes where people will focus is this narrow slice. Either, you know, everyone worries about integration testing, everyone worries about their user acceptance testing. So they focus on these tiny areas of the value stream. And that means that they're not seeing all of the upstream contributions, which means it's very challenging to actually solve anything. Because the problems that you see in user acceptance testing, the problems you see in QA, they're all caused way earlier in the process, right? So you really have to look at the entire value stream to start to understand how value breaks down and how information breaks down and how the work bogs down and gets constrained by different factors. So we start by beginning at the very inception of change, whether that's a request from customers or it's pulling something off of the backlog, or an internal stakeholder comes up with something. And by starting there and looking at percent complete and accurate, a common quality measure in the value stream, we can see where is there a difference between what we aim to do and what we're doing. And we can see that flow and break down over time, so that by the time you get to the parts that you think are really challenging, rightly so, because, you know, we can feel these things. We don't always have to map the value stream and discover, oh, well, here's where the problem is. Humans are usually pretty good at feeling like this is really where it all goes wrong. But understanding why and understanding the factors that are affecting that, and addressing the problem, it's very much like diagnosing a physical condition, right? I mean, if you have a sore hip, looking at your hip is going to give you a little bit of information, but looking at how you walk is going to give you a ton of information. Looking at how you reach for something 8 times a day is going to give you a ton of information. You have to look upstream. You have to look at the big picture in order to fix these problems. And so the value stream really opens people's eyes because it jogs us out of our natural, innate way of tackling problems by focusing as tightly as possible to thinking more in systems and thinking in terms of flow of, this is happening because of something earlier, something that is contributing to this, or maybe multiple factors contributing. And being able to see that and break it apart through mapping is very powerful, because it's not so simple that we can keep it in our heads. Nobody can keep it in their head because there's too many players involved, and we all have different ideas in our heads. And so pulling those out, putting them together, and seeing what we all see when we combine our perspectives is very powerful.
So one of the concepts you have is you talk about clarity, value, and flow. So that first part there, where you just going in, you're sort of saying, well, that first bit of thinking, is that the clarity part?
Exactly. Yeah. And clarity, really, these are almost laddered concepts where clarity is essential throughout everything that we do, right? The moment we lose clarity, we start to veer off into the wrong direction. So clarity has to be present in everything that we do, which means not just for us, but everyone together, because everyone is involved. Everyone in the value stream is contributing, and we all need clarity, because you can't have one person rowing in the wrong direction. And then, once you have clarity, you're able to define value. You know what value looks like. You understand what is necessary to deliver value. And flow is the last piece, because if you have flow without value, you're just delivering garbage very effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. How much more? And that, I think we've all worked on those projects.
We're doing great. We're burning down everything, and then but nobody's using what we're building.
Yeah, and generally, like let's say that you either find yourself in one or other camp. You you've got no value, but you've got loads of flow. In which case, like you say, got lots of garbage, or you know where the value is, but you've got no flow, and that's where probably, I think more of the people we work with that we help are in that situation, that they know what they want, but it's just painful. And it's funny that you mentioned integration testing, because that seems to also be a big place. Yeah, we've got quite a big test practice in our business. We've got some great test people, and they keep on saying it's all about shifting the testing left.
Right.
It's like concurrent manufacturing is all about shifting the manufacturing left, but you got to shift the testing left, because you've got to test when it's cheap and easy. Because when you get to integration testing, it's brittle and expensive and takes time consuming, and shift it all left. But it's
one of the things that often shows up in value streams, when I'm illustrating a value stream with a team, it's always very telling to get everyone's perspective on where are we validating, where are we testing right now. And usually what happens is we see, so what we'll do is very high level, we'll say, like, just everyone put a green dot on a step where we're validating work. And all the dots go to the end of the process. Everyone is testing at the end. And, what I try to call attention to is, when we create a story, we pull something off the backlog, do we not check that it's correct, that it makes sense to us, that that it's a quality story, that it has specific attributes that we've defined as important or necessary? And when someone gets handed some work, do they not validate that it's it has enough information, that they understand the context. There is, but I think we need to truly design for feedback and validation. And this is part of the mindset shift, is that everything needs to be validated all the time. We're always reconciling our perspective against what we have encountered, right? We're always making predictions about something being good enough, or that we're ready to take it to the next level. We're ready to add our value to it. But a lot of that is based on kind of assumption and habit rather than process, and guardrails to ensure that we don't slip off. And what happens is, when it's not part of a process, if it's not systematic, then it just degrades, right? It just over time, and no wonder 6 months down the road, a year down the road, everything is breaking, because it's just been chipping away and chipping away and chipping away.
Yeah, because again, one of the other concepts of total quality management is it's like a chain. It's like a chain, and each link in the chain, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Right.
And it's a similar thing with value. That the amount of value of the value of your feature is only as good as as all the preceding steps and all the ones that follow. That they all have to be valuable, because, like I say, if you get to the end of if you're doing your particular step and you've been handed a piece of garbage, then the best you can do is roll it in glitter. So you can have a shiny piece. You can have a shiny piece of garbage go out the other side, but ultimately,
hopefully nobody notices. Yeah.
Hopefully nobody notices. But it's that whole thing, isn't it? That it's every link in the chain is needed, because if like I really like the fact that you mentioned that whole thing of validating the backlog, because if that's wrong, then no matter how good the rest of it is, it's not going to work right from the start. And yet, I don't. I know we. Usually you have a product owner that prioritizes a backlog, and then away you go.
Right.
And
And for me, like, prioritizing the backlog, I find product owners often skip right to prioritizing the backlog based on some rubric that is not defined, right? They're not referencing a decision filter, or a flow of analysis that is separating work that's ready from work that is not ready, work that is extremely high value to customers or the company. Incorporating things like technical debt as potential opportunities that they can combine. If we work on this story now, we can use part of this effort to refactor this thing. That takes a lot of experience, but I think you can also systematize it, right? I mean, simple checklists, simple models, and rubrics and decision filters can help us do these things, so that it doesn't have to all be experience. It doesn't have to all be personal judgment. And we've learned this in manufacturing, right? You don't rely on people draining their cognitive ability and making decisions all day, because we know that people's decisions break down over the day. We're not good at making the same decision over and over again. That's why we have systems. That's why we have more systems than ever when it comes to software. There's no reason why we can't set up all of these guardrails and protections and let people be creative, instead of doing robotic actions like, if this then that. Like, we should be beyond that. That's a silly thing for humans to do, especially if you're over the course of a year, maybe a product owner is processing 5,000 items in a backlog, and if all they do is like, looks good enough, and shuffles it through, we're wasting that person's potential. We're not improving the way that we do the work. And that person is eventually just, they're getting tired. They're getting tired of that every single day. And they're not able to see the feedback from that process, right? They're not able to improve because there's no benchmark, there's no baseline to reference. And I think that it goes even further beyond that, to where that backlog, I think we have a long way to go with backlog management, or whatever we want to call it. Like I'm not a product person,
that's a whole podcast in itself, isn't it?
Yeah,
that one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I won't spend a lot of time, but I think there's a lot that we can do testing with customers before we even decide to build things, right? I mean, you have so much access to customers now and information about value, that not having it inform the very earliest steps of the process and throughout your entire process is really a shame. It's something that we're missing.
So yeah, one of the customers that we're working with, I'm really impressed with the way they've gone about it, because they literally they found their customers first, and then they said, "What are your problems?"
Right. Imagine that.
Imagine that. And then they said, "If we built something to fix those problems, would you buy it?" And then they said, "Which ones are the most important?"
Mm.
And then just did some screen mock-ups to say, if it looked like this, what do you think? Would you still buy it? And so the thing with that is that, and so I'm just really impressed that is so rare that people actually go through that process. But the result of it was that we've been helping them with building their product, but before they even, from the point at which they had wireframes, they'd already sold it.
Mm.
It was already sold. The value was already there, and they knew exactly what to build, because just by asking those simple questions, it's like, well, how hard can it be? So
yeah, and I think that again, that is lean in action, and it's been spelled out in great detail with lean startup and lean enterprise. Great examples of how to do that in software, and I think that it really only has permeated to pilot projects, greenfield products in most organizations. But there's really no excuse not to have it be the default, right? Learning is the superpower, and fast learning is really the thing that influences everything else. It is the thing that is going to improve the performance of everything that you do. So having it be a side project or skunk works or something that is happening at the edges of your company is really missing a huge opportunity.
And the whole, let's say, the whole thing is that and it comes back to this whole thing of flow, like you say, that I mean, one of the things that that they always say with startups is it's fail fast, fail early, fail cheap. And I just wonder how much of it is because so a good thing to do is to regard failure as learning, and the quicker you can fail, the quicker you can learn, the quicker you can not make that mistake again. And I just wonder how much of it is down to people in their mindset not being afraid of failure, because and then you end up with this whole thing of you end up with like, oh, I've got to do all this testing, and if we're going to do all this testing, then we've got to get loads of features in, and then you're at 6 months, and then you're at a 6-month release cycle, and loads of people have been there, put their seal of approval on it, and
and then they're terrified of failure,
and then they're terrified of failure. And I'm just wondering how much of it is actually there, how much of the root of all that is fear of failure.
I think we foster that fear of failure by not having systems for failure, right? Tolerances is very important in failure. because without guardrails, failure means there's gigantic failure, there's catastrophic failure, there's tiny little learning failures. There's missing your mark, right? There's oh, my hypothesis was slightly incorrect and I'm going to adjust it and try again. That's where we want to be. And I think that most organizations and teams do not have those guardrails around failure. And so a lot of leadership will say, well, yeah, you guys like fail fast. Great. That sounds terrible to me. Like, good luck. I'm crossing my fingers, but I don't trust this. And I'm not comfortable with the idea that we're going to fail as much as we can. I think there's a missing piece around we have a system to facilitate high value learning. You can decouple failure from that. Focus on the positive, and by framing it in learning, you're pulling it closer to hypothesis and empirical examination. And I think that's where the value is, and that's where I see, convincing people to fail is a challenging hypothesis to try and tackle, but showing people that they can build systems of learning, that I think is where we need to go. That I think is a much more positive and accessible frame that the business is going to be comfortable with, that the people who are afraid of failure are going to be comfortable with, and makes it something achievable, but it also makes it something that grows and adapts and improves over time. We're building systems. Really, I think it makes things much less scary and improves our ability to get value from whatever we're doing. Building, learning, I see it as all the same, all part of the value stream.
That's fantastic. No, I'm conscious that we've been rabbiting on for quite a while, Steve. So I think we need to sort of start kind of moving to the end of this. But one of the things you've just recently finished a book. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your book and when it's out, where it's available, and that sort of thing?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll link to the book in the show notes. It's just a little ebook that packages up the ideas and the process behind what I call flow engineering, which is basically a label that I threw on top of the way that I do value stream mapping and other mapping techniques a few years ago. And I've been sort of building out this idea that people think of value stream mapping and they think, oh, well, maybe I've tried that before and it wasn't great. It took a long time and we ended up with this really complicated map that wasn't very useful. Or I looked at Wikipedia and it seems too close to this manufacturing to be useful to me. So I kind of wanted to decouple people's thinking about value stream mapping and introduce my approach, which is very, very lightweight, very, very simplified, aiming for that 80% of value with 20% of the effort. But I've also layered in more maps that begin with defining outcomes, because I found that a lot of teams don't have clarity around what are we trying to do? What's really going to make a difference for us? What are we really aiming for? And so we do outcome mapping as part of the process initially to try and clarify and get everybody aligned on where we're going. Why are we doing any of this? Because oftentimes we do value stream mapping, not everyone is on board, right? Mm-hmm. People haven't heard of it before. They might have just got the invite like the morning of. And so it can be challenging to think that everyone is excited and understands what we're trying to do, and they're ready to contribute. So starting with the outcome mapping piece, which is very similar to something like impact mapping. And in the ebook, I'm kind of comparing the way that I do things with other ways that people can approach these things, because it's not prescriptive. They're just activities that I think are very high value. So you can use different methods to get clarity on outcomes. I'm not inventing clarity on outcomes. I'm also not inventing value stream mapping or even like simple ways of doing value stream mapping. Lots of people have different ways. Event storming is very popular and it's similar to value stream mapping. And you may be able to substitute that if that's what you're familiar with. But then beyond that, what we look at are dependencies. So I look outside the value stream because I was working with teams where they would say, well, you know, like we feel pretty good about our process, but we have this SLA with the legal team. And every time we have to do a release, we have to go out to legal and they have a 10-day SLA. And that takes up 30% of the value stream. So by visualizing dependencies outside of the value stream, we're able to produce this map, this asset that we can bring to the other parts of the organization and have a conversation and say, here's our flow, here's where you fit in, and is there anything that we can do to get this to better? What if we, you know, what if we did early validation of legal requirements so that when it came for you, time for you to approve things, you could just go down the checklist and maybe identify things where, you know, you're adding value instead of everything. Maybe there's things that we can shift left and do early. So we do things like that with dependency mapping. And then with capability mapping, what we look at is inside the team. So inside the value stream, what are the specific capabilities that address the bottlenecks that we see? So we're not looking at every capability. And I think a lot of capability mapping and assessment is very heavyweight, takes a lot of time, and is of limited value because it's not every capability matters all the time. And not every possible capability should be measured to the same degree.
But there are always a few that are the critical ones.
Right. I care about the ones that are affecting the pain points and the constraints. So by taking every capability and narrowing it down to 8 to 10, all of a sudden we can look at them in really great detail, highlight where we might be able to boost their performance. And the team goes from, we could be doing anything to get better, to we have 3 things that we're going to do tomorrow. And then we have 3 more things that we're going to do next week. And that means that they see massive results in a very short amount of time with very, very little effort. Like we're talking a few hours to put all this together. So I've never seen anything like that. And that's why I built this out, because I wanted something very accessible to teams that brought them together, that got all of the information that's stuck in their heads out so that everyone could share the same view and head in a direction that was very clear, very actionable, and made it easy for them to get started.
That's fantastic. No, you sent me over the proof version of this, and I read through it. It was fantastic. It's so easy to pick up. You know,
Thanks.
The way that you describe it. I mean, it isn't. Yeah, this, like you say, this isn't hard. It's here's 4 steps, and then we go through these 4 steps, and outcomes, value streams, dependencies, and capabilities, and then it's not hard. And like you say, depending on how many people you've got to involve in that, it doesn't take that long to get people in a room and to go through that stuff. But actually, the framework that gives you and the insights into where the problems are, because like you say, sometimes you only have to fix 2 key problems. You may know you've got 30 problems, but actually, if you fix 2 of them, most of it's that unblocks most other things. So I definitely advise everyone else to let's say we'll put the link in the show notes, and advise everyone to have a read through that, because it's not a long read, but it's just packed full of packed full of insight in a if you're measuring insight per page, you come out really well.
I might quote you on that. That's a fantastic testimonial. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, you can have that one. Okay, so I've so thanks everyone for watching this. I've been talking to Steve Pereira, and Steve, it's been fantastic having you on the podcast, and we'll catch you soon. All right,
Yeah, I
bye
hope
now.
to. It's been a
Yeah.
pleasure. Thanks.